I'm walking to work again. It's early in the morning. I can tell we're shifting towards fall. It's darker longer. And, as usual, a whole bunch of things are going through my head and thinking about them. And just a real, I don't even know how to describe it, but I'm thinking about a bunch of stuff, and I'm not sure which one I want to talk about. I don't know why I'm doing this, making these videos and stuff, and I guess it gives me a chance to just unload. Last few weeks I felt like my brain's pretty full, and I just need to evacuate. So yeah. Okay, well, one of the things that I'm thinking about this morning is this book that I read a few years ago. I read it in a class on the French Revolution. It was a great class. I learned a ton. It was a funny group, though, I think. Discussions were hard, and I always have a hard time in classes. I always feel like it's easy for me to take over discussions, and I don't want to do that. I want to give everybody else a chance to say what they have to say, especially because, I already know what I think. I already know how I'm interacting with the material. There were a few people, even in that group, who they would say things, and I would think oh man, I can't believe I missed that in there. So, anyways, in this class on the French Revolution, we read this book by this guy named Timothy Tackett. He's a historian, and the book is called When the King Took Flight, and it's a more of a I don't know if the word is accessible or popular or what. It's a history book written by an academic historian, but that isn't necessarily written with an academic audience in mind, but with a more general audience in mind. And so it's easier to read. It's very well written. And I blew through the entire book in no time. I think I read the whole thing in 3, maybe 4 days. And I really liked it. Especially because it's this more accessible history, I always I understand why professional historians write professional histories, and talk to each other. I understand why, but I always feel like that seeds the ground in a unintentional way to these more popular historians like Chernow or McCullough. I think in American history, David McCullough is held up as the preeminent historian. The guy's not even a historian. He's got a bachelor's degree in literature. He's not writing history. He's writing literature with a historical backdrop. I mean, his books aren't bad. He does a good job and he's fair, but it's narrative history. And the thing with narrative history, I think, is that it's not that it doesn't make an argument, it's that the narrative becomes the argument. That what it does is it teaches that history happened just so. And I don't know, maybe you get that in academic histories too. So maybe I'm, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, which, let's face it, if I knew anything, I wouldn't be, walking to work at 5:30 in the morning. Anyways, So this book, When the King Took Flight by Timothy Tackett, tells the story of when Louis XVI attempted to flee Paris and flee France and make it to, I think he was trying to make it behind Austrian lines, if I remember correctly, and kind of not necessarily abandon the country, but definitely abandon the revolution, you know. And what Tackett does in this book is he shows, he's arguing, you know, one of the many things that he does in this book is showing how this event, when Louis attempts to flee, that this event and Louis's actions are what turns the revolution against the monarchy. That up until this point, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that the revolution was going to chop off the king's head. And that in fact, there were very, very strong currents in the other direction. And I read the book and I understood the point, and I thought it was a good point, but it really didn't hit home with me until we were in class and we were discussing it. And during the discussion, we turned to this image, this political cartoon that's included in the book to show the turn away from monarchy, the popular turn away from monarchy. And this political cartoon has Louis XVI's head on top of a pig's body, and the pig's body is in a barrel of wine, and you know, Louis's face is fat, rotund, and across from him stands this figure in clothes from an older period with a pointed beard, and he's looking at Louis, and he says something along the lines of, you know, my son, how could it come to this, you know, something along those lines. And as we're discussing it and looking at this cartoon, I realized that this figure in this cartoon is Henry of Navarre. Henry of Navarre, Henry IV of France, is an important figure in French history. He was a French Protestant leader during a prior era of French Civil War, and he was in the line of succession and ended up becoming King of France. But in order to become King of France, he converted to Catholicism, and he famously said, you know, Paris is worthy of a mass. And he's held up in the French histories as this hero who willingly puts his own personal good aside for the good of the country, for the good of the people, and that this is emblematic of a good king, a good father. And you know, after that, I decided I was going to write my paper in this class on this relationship between Henry of Navarre and Louis XVI, and I think it's probably one of the better papers that I wrote in my college career, and because it was more focused on a simple and straightforward argument. I had been toying with a lot of things. One of the things that I wanted to write about was Robespierre, and how Robespierre is seen as this Machiavellian figure. You know, if I don't know where I've heard it. I don't know where I've seen it, but I think it's accurate to say that Robespierre is often held up as this archetypal Machiavellian figure, which to me is hilarious, because if you actually read, get driving with his brights on, if you actually read Machiavelli, you'd realize that Robespierre is not at all what Machiavelli's talking about. In fact, where Robespierre would fit into the Machiavellian narrative would be, Robespierre would be the Machiavellian foil, and the real Machiavellians would be the guys that kill Robespierre and then turn around and call his reign the Terror. That's Machiavellian. Anyways, so I was thinking about that, because I always like these, theoretical, philosophical, pointless, nonsensical arguments that, what does it matter, But this, looking at this cartoon really changed that for me, and I hyper-focused in on this relationship. And I still got to do some kind of philosophical, theoretical stuff, talk about myth and that kind of stuff, because it turns out there is an abundance of political cartoons that feature Louis XVI and Henry of Navarre. And before the flight from Paris, those political cartoons show Louis XVI as being guided by and living in the example of Henry IV and Louis XII. These are the great kings of French history. And Henry IV, because he was willing to put the good of his country ahead of his own personal desires, his own personal needs. And then, after the flight, Louis is portrayed in political cartoons as a betrayer of Henry's example. And so we see this popular notion in France through these political cartoons of this, appropriate kingship, this to borrow a term, this right-ordered kingship. And Henry represents the correct form of monarchy. So it's interesting, right? Because we always hear about Louis XIV, the Sun King. He's the prototypical French monarch, But in these political cartoons, celebrating Louis XVI for his role as the father of the revolution, basically, Louis XIV doesn't appear. Henry IV does. So that might tell you something about where the narratives about Louis XIV come from. Not that he's not an important king and that he wasn't celebrated or anything like that, but it's just interesting that, in these political cartoons expressing this popular view, expressing a popular view, that's important. A popular view, not the only view. But in these political cartoons across the early years of the Revolution, whenever Louis is celebrated as this model monarch who's guiding the nation as a noble father, he appears next to an image of Henry IV, Henry of Navarre. So that's what I wrote my paper about, and I included a bunch of these political cartoons showing that, that this is the relationship that's being ascribed to Louis in part of the popular imagination and that after the flight, that changes. The political cartoons continue to have Henry of Navarre in them, alongside Louis, but depict Louis not as following Henry's example, but as betraying it, betraying the principle of monarchy that Henry establishes. So, if I were to cast a wider net, I would tie this into Greek ideas, which isn't, I don't think, too inappropriate for the French Revolution. Not to say that these Greek ideas are, governing the revolution, but to show how there's this trend in these views of monarchy across place and time, and how each group, each time period, plays with these symbols differently, but and is saying something different, but that they're also, repeating a familiar refrain in some ways with a new spin on it, So in Greek myth, you have the story of the Minotaur. The Minotaur is this beast that lives in Crete in a labyrinth that they have to feed people to. Minos, the king, who's the last king of Crete, keeps it locked up in a labyrinth and brings prisoners, seven young men from Athens every year to feed to the Minotaur. Well, Minos is the king, and he's the last king. And there's something very important that's at the core of this myth, that I think is not always picked up on. I think Joseph Campbell mentions this, though. Anyways, the Minotaur comes about because Minos asks the gods to send a symbol of their approval of his kingship. And Poseidon sends this white bull, this majestic, beautiful white bull, out of the ocean. And it's understood that Minos is then required to sacrifice this bull to complete the divine approval. But Minos looks at this bull and he sees that it's, better than any other bull. And he wants to breed a race of these bulls. He wants to use this bull to increase his wealth, increase his prestige, and so he substitutes the bull with another. And the gods curse him, and Minos' wife becomes enamored with this bull and has Daedalus conceive this contraption so that she can, have sex with the bull. And from this union, the Minotaur is produced. And what's at the heart of the story is that Minos, as the king, has to put off the private citizen. The private, he's no longer an individual person. He has to put the good of the realm above the good of Minos, his own personal good. And he can't do that. And so that's what, he asks for the bull for a confirmation of his kingship. But the bull alone isn't the confirmation that he needs. It's Minos' willingness to put aside his own profit, his own glory, his own prestige, for the benefit of his kingdom, by sacrificing the bull. And he refuses to do it. He holds back. And so Minos is not fit to be king because he still holds on to his own good, his own profit over that of the kingdom. And there's a similar narrative theme here in the story of Minos and the story of the Minotaur and the story of Louis and the flight to Varennes. So, just interesting stuff to babble, prattle on about pointlessly as I go off to work and try to evacuate my brain a little, because I've been noticing lately it's, my head's getting full of stuff and I need to get it out. So, because I've been, I was plowing through books there for a while. I was reading a book and a half a week for a couple months, and I'm slowing down because there's too much rattling around in there, and I need to get it out. So there you have it. Interesting, pointless blathering.